For decades, the world has celebrated the triumph of justice at Nuremberg, yet a crucial chapter was deliberately erased. The Allied powers agreed to conceal Soviet-backed massacres that unfolded across Eastern Europe after the war. The beneficiaries were not only the emerging superpowers seeking geopolitical stability, but also the very victims whose suffering was buried beneath diplomatic convenience. The repercussions echo today, shaping how we understand accountability and reminding us that the price of peace can be measured in silences. This suppression was not a single act of betrayal, it was an institutional pattern, an orchestrated system that normalized the omission of crimes whenever they threatened the fragile balance of post-war order. In July 1946, as the dust settled over Berlin and the Allied Security Council convened to define the scope of war crime prosecutions, a quiet agreement took shape. The Western Allies, wary of provoking the Soviet Union in an already tense Europe, consented to exclude any evidence linking Soviet forces to mass atrocities. The decision was framed as a pragmatic necessity for post-war stability, yet it set a precedent. Political expediency would outweigh moral imperatives whenever the two collided. The first casualty of this hidden pact was the truth about the Katyn massacre. In the spring of 1940, Soviet troops executed roughly 24,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, and civilians in the forest near the village of Katyn. When German forces discovered the mass graves in 1943, they publicized the atrocity, but the Soviets swiftly blamed the Nazis, a narrative that found reluctant acceptance among many Western officials desperate to keep the alliance intact. British Foreign Office intelligence units, tasked with sifting through battlefield reports and intercepted communications, noted glaring inconsistencies. Photographs of the bodies, forensic analyses, and eyewitness testimonies pointed unmistakably towards Soviet responsibility. Yet these documents were filed under security matters and never presented to the Nuremberg judges. The Allies' refusal to challenge the false narrative allowed a lie to become part of the official record. The suppression extended beyond diplomatic statements. In 1945, as the Allied occupation zones in Germany were being formalized, the United States and Britain exchanged classified memoranda that warned of the political fallout should the Katyn truth be aired. The emerging Cold War rivalry began to shape priorities. Confronting Soviet crimes risked destabilizing a fragile peace and providing propaganda fodder for an adversary still perceived as a wartime ally. While the world focused on the horrors perpetrated by Nazi Germany, another wave of suffering surged across Central Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the war, ethnic Germans were expelled from Czechoslovakia, Poland, and other Eastern Bloc states in a series of forced migrations that displaced millions. These expulsions, sanctioned by the Potsdam Agreement but executed with brutal efficiency, resulted in widespread loss of life, starvation, and trauma. British intelligence officers stationed in Prague and Warsaw compiled extensive reports on the scale of these operations, details of train convoys overloaded with civilians, accounts of violence at border checkpoints, and statistics on mortality rates. Yet when the Allied Security Council drafted its final agenda for war crime tribunals, the British Foreign Office classified the expulsion files as sensitive security information, arguing that publicizing them would inflame ethnic tensions and jeopardize the nascent post-war order. The decision mirrored the earlier Katyn concealment, a pattern of treating uncomfortable truths as diplomatic liabilities rather than matters for legal redress. By labeling the expulsions as merely administrative measures, the Allies effectively insulated themselves from scrutiny over policies that, while not directly orchestrated by Western powers, were facilitated by their tacit approval. By 1947, the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies against a common foe, now stood on opposite sides of an emerging ideological divide. This rivalry redirected intelligence resources toward espionage, nuclear development, and proxy conflicts, relegating war crime investigations to the background. American agencies, including the Office of Strategic Services' successor, the Central Intelligence Agency, began cataloging Soviet military archives for clues about future threats. The focus was on strategic capabilities, not on documenting past atrocities. Simultaneously, British intelligence prioritized monitoring communist parties across Europe, fearing internal subversion more than seeking accountability for wartime murders. The Cold War curtain thus obscured the earlier pact's consequences. Investigative teams that might have unearthed suppressed evidence were reassigned to counterintelligence tasks. Funding for historical commissions dwindled, and legal scholars were encouraged to concentrate on contemporary security concerns. The systemic neglect of war crimes became an unintended byproduct of a world increasingly preoccupied with the next confrontation. In the early 1950s, both British and American governments enacted formal restrictions on access to wartime documents that touched upon the suppressed atrocities. Classified under special access provisions, these archives could be consulted only by cleared officials within the intelligence community. Researchers who requested files on Katyn or the German expulsions were met with bureaucratic delays, vague citations of national security, and in many cases, outright denial. The policy was justified publicly as a safeguard against compromising ongoing diplomatic negotiations. Privately, internal memos reveal a different motive, preserving the narrative that had been carefully constructed during the 1946 Allied meetings. By locking down the evidence, the governments ensured that future generations would inherit an incomplete historical record, one that omitted the Soviet and Allied complicity in post-war bloodshed. The effect was cumulative. As decades passed, the lack of primary sources reinforced the myth that the Allies had pursued justice uniformly. Academic curricula mirrored this skewed perspective, teaching students about Nuremberg's triumphs while glossing over the silence surrounding Eastern Europe's tragedies. The archive lockdown became a structural reinforcement of the original hidden pact. Despite institutional barriers, a handful of journalists and independent scholars began to notice gaps in the official story during the late 1960s. A British reporter, digging through declassified wartime cables, uncovered references to unpublished evidence of Soviet atrocities that had been deliberately withheld from public hearings. In the United States, a historian examining the Pentagon's foreign policy archives found memoranda urging senior officials to avoid raising Katyn at diplomatic forums. These discoveries sparked quiet protests within diplomatic circles. Letters were sent to Foreign Office ministers and State Department officials, urging transparency and warning that continued concealment could damage credibility in the long term. However, the responses were measured and non-committal. "We recognize the importance of historical accuracy," one note read, "but current priorities demand discretion." The journalist's work did not lead to immediate legal action or mass public outcry. Instead, it kept the suppressed narratives alive within a small but determined community. Their persistence laid the groundwork for later declassification efforts, demonstrating how even limited exposure can challenge entrenched systems of silence. The collapse of the Soviet bloc in the early 1990s opened a new chapter in the quest for truth. Declassification initiatives across former Eastern Bloc states released thousands of documents related to wartime and post-war operations. In Russia, archives revealed internal communications confirming Soviet responsibility for Katyn and acknowledging the scale of German expulsions authorized by Allied agreements. Western governments responded with partial releases. The British National Archives opened select files on the expulsion files, while the U.S. National Security Archive made available a series of CIA memoranda discussing the political calculus behind suppressing evidence. Scholars seized upon these materials, sparking vigorous academic debate about the moral implications of the 1946 Pact. Yet, despite the flood of information, legal redress remained elusive. Statutes of limitations, diplomatic immunity, and the passage of time meant that few, if any, prosecutions were pursued against lower-level perpetrators whose crimes had been hidden for decades. The re-examination era highlighted a paradox. History could finally be told, but justice, as traditionally conceived, was largely out of reach. Today, documentary projects and human rights organizations compile the surviving testimonies, photographs, and archival excerpts to construct a more complete picture of the post-war atrocities that were once deliberately omitted. The narrative they present is not one of sensational revelation, but of sober reflection on how political compromise can eclipse moral responsibility. the legacy of the Hidden Pact endures in contemporary debates over transparency, accountability, and the role of state secrecy. It serves as a reminder that systems designed to protect immediate geopolitical interests may sow seeds of long-term mistrust. When justice is postponed for stability, the wounds of the past linger beneath the surface, influencing how societies reckon with their histories. In confronting this legacy, we are called upon to balance pragmatic concerns with an unwavering commitment to truth. The suppressed shadows of 1946 teach us that silence, once institutionalized, becomes a part of the historical record itself, one that future generations must strive to illuminate, however imperfectly. Only by acknowledging these omissions can we hope to build a world where political necessity no longer trumps the imperative to bear witness to all victims of war.